It is Friday, and it's another edition of Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson. We have a ton of mailbag questions to get into, so we're going to fill our first two segments with that. And lastly, what are my expectations for J.J. Picollo in year two? That's all coming up next on Locked On Royals.
You are Locked On Royals, your daily Kansas City Royals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you for tuning in to another edition of Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, I'm your host, Jack Johnson. You can follow me on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. And be sure to catch all of these podcasting episodes wherever you get your podcast. That can be Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, and on YouTube. Just be sure to hit that follow button and subscribe. If this is your first episode ever tuning in to Locked On Royals, of course, welcome in. And I'm sure you're wondering who I am. And I'm just a diehard Royals fan, as I'm sure you are, tuning into some Royals content during the offseason. I also work here in Kansas City at Sports Radio 810 WHB. I've got a morning show on ESPN Kansas City, a night show on Sports Radio 810. So I stay pretty busy with my day job covering sports. But when you come here, you are only going to hear about the Kansas City Royals. We are your outlet for information, for opinions, for thoughts, for takeaways, breaking news, all that stuff. So when you want to hear that, when you want to see that either on YouTube or just on Spotify, Apple Podcast, etc., come to the Locked On Royals channel. As for those podcasting outlets, be sure to leave a review as well. You know, with YouTube, we always talk about subscribing and continue to do that. Of course, if you already have, send it to somebody who has it. But for Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, if there's an ability to rate it or an option to rate it, leave something on the podcast. I want your feedback. I would like to know, what we can do better here. If you're really enjoying it, if you're not so much enjoying it, I just want to get good feedback because as I continue to harp on, we want to make this thing as good as possible. We want to make you, the listener, a big part of this show because we feel like that's the most important way to do it moving forward. And making the listener a part of this show is always a big thing. And I feel like on Fridays, we do a pretty good job of that with our Mailbag Fridays. I really let the listeners dictate sometimes the first two segments. And we had so many questions yesterday that we're going to turn this into two segments today because I want to give as much time as I can to the questions that were put through on Twitter. And you don't always have to just respond to the tweet that I put out there from my account out at JohnnyJ_15. You also can just direct message me. If you don't really want your question to be public, my inbox is open. So pretty easy to reach me there. And I'll always make sure it is answered on this podcast. And if you don't want your name to be put alongside it, don't worry. I'm not going to say it out loud on the podcast. But that's only if you tell me to, because I also want to give you credit for asking what is typically a very good question. So let's dive right into it for our Mailbag Friday segment with question number one. This comes from Brian, who says, who is a realistic number one starting pitching target the Royals should be gunning for, in your opinion? I know that I think in the past I've done a couple of podcasts, bringing up some options. And here's the thing Brian kind of laid it out in his question. Realistic is a big part here. If the Royals were going to go in there and spend, they technically could afford an Aaron Nola, who's been lights out for the Phils in the postseason. They can afford a Jordan Montgomery. But you also have to wonder, is giving Jordan Montgomery or Aaron Nola a 4 or 5 year deal worth it at this point of the rebuild for Kansas City? Who knows how much better those guys get? There's a chance Jordan Montgomery is not so good next year. And then you have that guy on the books for another 3 years. So I still believe the Royals are going to get their number one in the offseason. I feel like I've stayed pretty firm on that. I don't think they're going to go into opening day with Brady Singer as their number one or Cole Reagans as their number one. I think Reagans eventually takes that spot, but he's never thrown more than 100 innings in his big league career. It's kind of a bad idea to go give a guy who doesn't have that length yet the number one spot in your rotation. That's supposed to be the guy that logs you 200 innings. He's your workhorse. And I think there are guys out there that can be a number one. Now, there's a couple ways they can go about it. They can go spend a lot of money on a number one, or they could spend chunks of money on number 3s and number 4s to piece out the rotation. Both options, I think, are very good. But I believe at this point, because of age and because I don't think this season was as bad as it was made out to be, I think a realistic option, if you wanted to drop the money, and don't let the Royals fool you, they can afford it. If they really wanted to spend, they could go get themselves an Aaron Nola. I think the way he's pitched in the postseason, his price tag is only going up. I don't think Philadelphia would want him to leave, but that technically is a realistic option if the Royals wanted to spend the money. They don't have that much in payroll right now. Now, you think about moving Salvador Perez off the payroll. I know you're going to have to be sending some money his way via trade. If you choose that outlet, there's even more money off the books there. So to me, this feels like one of those options where you can go get a legitimate number 1. And a number 1, I don't think you need to worry about regressing. He's always been pretty good in Philadelphia, and maybe he doesn't want to go take a step down and go to Kansas City after pitching in what's very likely going to be the World Series again, back-to-back years. But don't let the Royals fool you. They can afford somebody like that. Just because they want a 5 or 6 year deal, the Royals can afford that. Okay, the Minnesota Twins spent big-time money to bring Carlos Correa in. I know it's a position player and not so much of a pitcher, so that's going to be a different type of price tag, but the Royals need pitching, and they need to be serious about getting a number 1. Don't go sign a number 4 to be a number 1. Aaron Nola is realistic. Jordan Montgomery, kind of in that same ballpark, and I know that I've harped on Jordan Montgomery, and I think that Gumby, as they call him, is a pretty good option. I just don't know if that success is going to carry into next year. I'm much more confident that Aaron Nola could do something like that. But that's kind of where I stand on it. The Royals can afford him. Now, it's a matter of, do they go out there and get him? I don't give it a very high percentage, but he's in the price range for what they have to offer. Every team can afford to pay a player like Aaron Nola. I think the Royals should take a long look into that if they're really serious about adding a number 1. Next question we have comes from Chance. What Royals player / prospect have you as a fan thought was the biggest disappointment that you thought was going to be great? And which player prospect were you wrong about that exceeded your expectations? I'm going to get this one out of the way, kind of the latter part of the question. I was so unbelievably wrong on Cole Reagans, and I'm going to stand by that. I'm going to own up to it because it was a dumb take at the time. When the Royals traded the Aroldis Chapman, I thought the deal was very underwhelming. There's a tweet out there from me saying, I don't really understand getting Cole Reagans, but I like the lottery throw-in for Ronny Cabrera. I said that. That's out there in the social media world. And how stupid of that was me now considering Cole Reagans looks to be not only your ace, but maybe a multiple-time All-Star, maybe has a Cy Young in his future. It's a small sample size, but the pure stuff, it plays at the big league level. So that, by far and away, was the guy I was wrong about with this current team. A guy that maybe I was really hopeful on that didn't pan out, I'm going to go ahead and say either Nick Pratto or Drew Waters. I think those would be the two guys right there that I maybe was a little bit higher on than most. I thought Nick Pratto's bat was going to play at the big league level. I thought that his approach was going to be really easy to translate from AA to AAA to the big leagues. And we just really haven't seen it. We've seen him have stretches, but not the power stretches I was hoping to see from a first baseman. I thought his glove would be better. The advanced metrics don't really support him. And Drew Waters, I would say that coming over from Atlanta, I thought roster crunch over there. He was a former number 1 prospect in that system. He's a switch hitter. Feels like he could play really well in Kansas City when given this opportunity to really open up. The Royals fixed his approach in AAA when he came over originally, cut down the swing and miss. But as we've seen with both these players, there's a common denominator here. They strike out a hell of a lot more than they should for their position. And when you don't hit for much power, you can't strike out 30 to 40% of the time. I mean, Nick Pratto finished this year with a 40% K rate. That can't play in the bigs. That just simply can't. So those two guys I was higher on, seemed to be wrong about. And the guy that I was not so high on that turned out to be a stud, Cole Reagans. And I'll live up to that. I'll own up to that because that was just an all-time bad take, a bad opinion, a freezing cold take, as some would call it, for this past season. All right, we're going to take our first break of the show. We're not done answering questions. We have 5 to 6 more questions to get into, and I want to give as much time as I can to those listeners that sent questions my way. That's coming up next on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson. You can catch me on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. Before we go any further, let's give a shout out to today's sponsor in Jase Medical. I know that in today's world, we're constantly stressing about a lot of things. Maybe you're stressing about payments. Maybe you're stressing about medical care, insurance, and all of that really can wear on you. That's a lot on your plate. It's a lot on your shoulders. Well, Jase Medical is going to have you covered. Jase Medical takes at least one thing off your plate in care. And I'm going to be honest with you. I live in a house now. It's my first time living in a house. I live in apartments my whole life. It's just, you got to worry about a lot more payments, things breaking down. But more importantly, medical care is really, really important because some things are replaceable and some things are not. Now, with Jase Medical, modern medical care and treatment are important, but our global supply chains are fragile. Things like pandemics, natural disasters, and foreign travel may cut you off from the treatment you need. Jase Medical is your solution. Just fill out their online form, and one of Jase Medical's board-certified physicians will review it to determine whether medications are safe and appropriate. Then Jase will send your prescriptions to one of their partner pharmacies where your order will be filled and mailed directly to your home. You can also send your physician a message for answers to treatment-related questions anytime. Everyone should be empowered to care for themselves and their loved ones during the unexpected. That's why Jase Medical offers the Jase case. Save more than $360 by getting these life-saving antibiotics with Jase Medical Plus, and an additional $20 off by using my code LOCKEDON at checkout on jasemedical.com. That's JASE medical.com. I don't want to waste any more time. I said that before the break. I'm going to continue to say it because we still have tons of questions to get into, and I want to make sure I get to every single one of them and give them the answers that are thoroughly thought out and answered in length. I don't want to give 1 or 2 word answers for these questions that you guys took the time to send my way. This one comes from Ben, who's going to be in the bullpen next year. Great question. I think the locks at this point are James MacArthur, Carlos Hernandez, John McMillan, and then maybe Dylan Coleman or Colin Snyder, depending on spring training. So there's my 4 guys. I apologize if I'm missing somebody off the top of my head. I'm just rambling off names here. But I think it seems pretty smart for the Royals to keep about 3 to 4. And Dylan Coleman and Colin Snyder, the only reason I'm giving them a little bit of hope is they've been working out at Tread, who I've been keeping up to date with their videos. They do fantastic work. Follow a couple guys on the Twitter. They're working out with a lot of pitchers. And Cole Reagans was there last offseason. We saw what it did for him this year. So I'm a little bit more hopeful on Dylan Coleman and Colin Snyder for a turnaround. Snyder was fine. He just has a problem walking guys. Kind of same thing for Dylan Coleman. But Coleman lost his velocity. So I would like to see Dylan Coleman back. And I'd like to see the old Dylan Coleman back that was pumping 98, 99, 100. So let's say for now, Dylan Coleman's in that bullpen. So there's 4 guys. Colin Snyder might be the swing man between Omaha and Kansas City. Then I think free agency is going to be a big part of this bullpen. And I don't think the Royals are going to sign minor league deal guys to bring him up to Kansas City. I think Ryan Stanek makes a lot of sense. Has local ties here, went to Blue Valley High School, went to Arkansas for college. His experience as an opener, which I think the Royals are going to carry the opener next year, that would be a very good option to go to. Phil Maton of the Houston Astros. That would be my home run bullpen pick for the offseason. That's the thing with bullpen guys. We talked about Aaron Nola in the first segment. The Royals are going to have to be competing with teams that are going to spend a lot more money than them. The Royals can still try to match that, but doesn't make too much sense. I think the Royals want to spend more money on their bullpen, spread it out a little bit more. Phil Maton is making less than, I think, $5 million a year on a 1-year contract. You can afford that. And if you want to convince him to come to a place unlike Houston, who's always going to the World Series or competing in championship series, well, you can incentivize it with a little bit more cash. He's pretty good this year. Instead of $5 million, give him $6.5. Give $6.5 with incentives, stuff like that. All of those things can be worked out. And on a 1-year deal, you can go as high as $15 million for some guys. Now, you don't pay that for a bullpen guy, but you kind of get what I'm getting at here. So Phil Maton, Ryan Stanek, I would love to add to this bullpen. Matt Moore, I think that's a cheap, easy option, was very good for the Angels. And I think that in Miami, he kind of showed that he can still be that guy. Cleveland, he didn't get to show much before they let him go when their postseason chances were blown away in the wind. But He couldn't compete in the postseason for Miami because of joining the team that late. But in Anaheim this year was really good. So there's maybe my 7th guy. And then maybe I'll throw that last option to an Angel Serpa, maybe an Alec Marsh, maybe a Jonathan Bowen or Anthony Veneziano. But that's kind of what I think it's going to look like. The Royals could always go after guys that we're not even looking into, like a James MacArthur last year. But for now, I'm going to stick with that group. I think they're going to be a little bit more aggressive in free agency. And that would be, I believe, a pretty good bullpen, which is what the Royals desperately need right now. Next question we have is from Matt. Why do people insist on using this year's win total when predicting next year's team? This past year was not a 50% outcome. It was a 10% outcome. If they spend legit money and do so quickly, a 500 season is absolutely within reach. I would say people are always going to use the previous years to make predictions for the next one because there's going to be a lot of pessimistic fans that go, they lost 106. If they don't spend any money, they're going to lose 100-plus games again. I would say the Royals need to spend maybe more than they have in the last decade to get to 500. Just because there's problems with the rotation. There's problems with the bullpen. There's still holes in the lineup, and that's a lot to fix. I don't necessarily think throwing money at everybody is going to make a 500 team, but you're exactly right. I mean, you go to the 2021 Royals, they won over 70 games by spending just a little bit more money than they typically do. Andrew Benintendi through trade, Carlos Santana, Mike Minor, Hanser Alberto. I mean, they added a few key guys to make that team more competitive. And that does make the team more watchable. So you're not crazy in saying that, Matt, because this is a team that I feel like has legitimate pieces. They just need a little bit more help right now. And starting on the pitching side of things can absolutely put them on their way to a 500 season. The next question that we have here is from Alejandro. He says the best free agent and the Royals could realistically sign this winter. You know, I could go back to my pick of Aaron Nola because I don't think his price range is going to be astronomical. We're not talking Shohei Ohtani or something like this, but I am going to go back to the bullpen here. I'm going to say Phil Maton again. Phil Maton, to me, solves a lot of problems in this bullpen. Now, not one bullpen guy is going to solve everything, but that's a pretty consistent guy and a guy you can easily afford. And I think that's going to be a bigger strength for the Royals next year. And I don't even know who's all going to be in it. I gave my predictions in this segment, but I really do feel like this is a group that is going to have to rely on its bullpen to win a lot of games next season. And Phil Maton can help you bridge that gap in the 7th, 8th, and 9th. You're not having to turn to Taylor Clark. You're not having to turn to Tucker Davidson. You can turn to a reliable and effective bullpen guy that is supported by every metric, has good numbers, strikeout numbers, doesn't throw incredibly hard, but is accurate. Royals need that in the bullpen. So to answer your question, Alejandro, I'm going to say Phil Maton. I think he's realistic. Royals need bullpen hope. J.J. Picollo said they need a lot of bullpen hope, and that's where they're going to try and spend their money this offseason. Pew Pew and Barbecues asks, any chance the team can make a big splash in international signings? You know, this is a great question. I think I answered it last week. They got to show me first. So right now I'm going to say no, it's not realistic because the Royals don't dip their toe into the international market that much. I think Japan has a lot of talented players. I mean, even Nori Aoki, who was on the Royals in 2014, the Royals didn't go over to Japan and get Nori Aoki. He was in Milwaukee. They traded Will Smith to get Nori Aoki. So even times when they've had international starters in their lineup, they're not going overseas to sign a guy and put them in their lineup. So for now, I'm going to say no, it's unrealistic. But hey, there is going to be a little bit of front office turnover. J.J. Picollo, of course, is still there, but we talked about Jen Wong leaving the organization after 24 years. Brian Bridges is now in the organization. Gene Watson no longer there. Maybe it's a sign of things to change, but they got to show me first before I make any true commitment to that. Jeremy on Twitter asks, Rangers or Stros in this series? I feel like I got to go with Texas here. I know now that the series is tightened up. You know, Texas wins the first 2 in Houston, and now Houston has won 2 in Arlington. But I am absolutely sticking with the Rangers here. I like the tie that Chris Young has. I think he's the best GM in all of baseball. I've said that before. And if you're voting or rooting for Houston, or voting for Houston in this poll, maybe you're just a Houston fan, because I would say the majority of baseball considers the Astros to be the villain, 1, because of the scandal, 2, because they win so damn much. But for now, I'm still holding out hope the Rangers can pull it off, because that's a fan base that has been starved a little bit. But Chris Young gave them a competitive team. They've been so fun to watch. Hopefully tonight they can bounce back in Game 5 of this series. And lastly, Chance asked, what player could the Royals sign that would frustrate you the most regarding that direction of the team? Great question, and I don't think I've gotten one like this before. I would say going after somebody like, it'd probably be in the pitching side of things. I once was high on Kyle Gibson as a number 4, number 5, but the Royals spend money on Kyle Gibson because they remember him in Minnesota. They think he was pretty good for Baltimore. If they gave Kyle Gibson a Jordan Lyles contract, I'd be pretty upset. Now, that would frustrate me because you just added not a Jordan Lyles, but a guy that I don't think makes your rotation significantly better. And I could see the Royals in past years trying to spin that as, hey, that's our number 2. That's our workhorse. Look what he was like in Baltimore. Jordan Lyles was in Baltimore the year before, so it kind of feels like they could turn to that outlet, especially with how many times they faced him in Minnesota. So I once was high on him. And if the Royals want to add him as a number 5, fine. But it has to be a 1-year, $6 million deal, not a 2-year, $19 million deal to be your number 2. So to answer your question, Chance, I'm going to go with Kyle Gibson. Okay, before we wrap up the show today, I do want to go into my expectations for J.J. Picollo in year 2. What do I need to see from the general manager and president of baseball operations of the Kansas City Royals? That's next on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson. Follow me on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. Before we go any further, let's give a shout out to the other title sponsor today in Sleeper. I've got some more picks for you. Now, yesterday I gave you picks for the ALCS with Jordan Montgomery and Justin Verlander. Tonight, I'm going to give you my predictions for the Arizona and Philly series. The D-backs, they took Game 3, so they're still breathing here, but it's an absolute must-win. I really do hate that saying. You can't fall behind 3-1 and expect to come back and win that series. It's just not going to be possible for a team like Arizona. So a must-win game, and unfortunately for them, it's a bullpen game. Now, this bullpen's been very good, but being a good bullpen and having a bullpen game are two completely separate things. Now you have guys in different roles. You're asking for them to go 2, 3, maybe even 4 innings. And I think the upper hand goes in favor of the Phillies tonight. So I'm going to make my picks on the Phillies side of things. I think Bryce Harper collects more than 1 hit, so just a multi-hit game for the superstar of the Philadelphia Phillies. And I think Trey Turner is going to use his bat and his legs tonight. I will take him to have at least 1 hit and 1 stolen base against Arizona in Game 4 of this National League Championship Series. Now, with Sleeper, the MLB playoffs are right around the corner, which means the clock is ticking on your chance to 100 times your cash on daily fantasy baseball. Baseball has never been more exciting than it is now with studs like Ronald Acuna Jr., Mookie Betts, and Shohei Ohtani. Pick more or less on stats for these stars like home runs, hits, strikeouts, and more for up to 100 times the payout on Sleeper. Get your picks right, and you could win big with Sleeper. Yesterday, in our podcast episode, we touched a little bit on Matt Quatraro for his expectations in year 2. And today I kind of wanted to look up to the front office and give an evaluation almost for J.J. Picollo and what I expect to see in year 2. I think it starts a lot earlier than Matt Quatraro, of course, because we need to see more of an urgency to add talent to this team. We need you to back up the words that were said a couple weeks back in the end of the season press conference. I mean, all of that is going to be put on the line here over the next couple months. Because to me, I lose respect for front office personnel. I lose respect for ownership. I lose respect for coaches when you say one thing and expect the fan base to bow at your feet, have this hope for you, and then you never really come through. I remember for the last couple of years under Dayton Moore, Dayton would talk about, competing in the division, would talk about getting in the postseason, how they have a competitive team, and they would go lose 100-plus games. That, to me, is not being honest with your fan base, and that is something the fan base has every right to criticize you for. So my evaluation is going to start here pretty much any day. Because once this season ends and free agency opens up and we inch closer to winter meetings in the Rule 5 draft, well, I want to see you back up what you said. If you want to add to the rotation, you want to revamp the bullpen, then do it. If you want to win 80 to 85 games next year, well, you need to add more talent than you have on this team. If you think a priority is to extend Bobby Wood Jr., which I know that wasn't really emphasized in the press conference, but it was discussed, I would like to see, contract negotiations ramp up a little bit. These are all things I think general managers and president of baseball operations know are coming. The expectation they got to be a little bit more aggressive. But I think we saw a lot of good in a terrible season. I think we saw a lot of good and a difference in mentality from the front office in 2023. Moves like Cole Reagans and Ronny Cabrera, moves like James MacArthur, to see the improvement from some of the guys that maybe you were losing hope on, to see the jump in production from Maikel Garcia, Bobby Witt Jr., even guys like Freddie Fermin. That to me is important, playing younger guys. And no, not everybody had a jump in production, and that's really more so on coaching in the front office. But the ability to stick with some guys, I'm not going to stand by, holding some guys down in AAA forever or AA forever. The draft, I was a little bit hesitant on, especially their first round pick with Blake Mitchell. I'm expecting, this coming summer for J.J. Picollo, my expectations at the absolute ceiling here. I'm not setting the bar low here. If you're picking 1, 2, or 3, hopefully 1, at worst 2, but you are adding a superstar talent to your system. You're not reaching. Okay, so my expectation is pretty damn high, I would say, for a general manager right now. Because this team needs to start being competitive for support for its fan base, to get on board with moving downtown. All of these things factor in here. You don't want to lose such a passionate fan base. That's about the worst thing I could say is happening in Kansas City, is that we've seen how great it is with the Royals competing, being competitive, being fun, and how fans long for those days. We still talk about those days. And when you hear the fan base talking about it over and over again, it should be your job, your responsibility, your duty to provide that to them. We see these other teams around baseball, Arizona, Baltimore, lose a lot of games and fix it 2 years later. You can't be stumbling around in year 6 or 7 of a rebuild, expecting fans to stay patient with you. This is the offseason. I want to see a difference. I want to see a sense of urgency. We lost 106. We want to improve our win total by nearly 30 games. You have to add talent that can win you 30 more games. If you want to be competitive into September, well, those are the ways you have to be competitive. And that's why I think J.J. Picollo is in a great spot here. This team is not tied up in a ton of payroll. This team has young talent on its roster. Now you have to help them out a little bit. And if you want to continue to find the James MacArthurs of the world and Cole Reagans, fine. That's all great and dandy. But I think we also can find that talent and still build a competitive roster. And that starts in a month here. Once this season ends, I expect this team to, not even a month actually, a couple weeks here, the season will be over. I expect the team to start jumping on things. Be the first to the box of food. Be the first to the dinner table to start handing out offers. You have to compete. I mean, even Detroit, they were more competitive this year. It didn't work out in their Javi Baez deal. It worked out in their Eduardo Rodriguez deal. But they spent money. They were losing a lot of games. They wanted to be more competitive. They finished in second place. They were pretty damn competitive this year. And that's something I want the Royals to do in 2024. This offseason, big one for him. My expectations are pretty high. You may be lower on him, but I got to see it now. If you're going to say these at press conferences, I'm not going to believe you and then not give you any grief or any criticism if it doesn't come through. If you really are serious about adding and you want to improve this team by that much, you got to start doing it here in a couple of weeks. Well, that's going to do it for another edition of Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I've been your host, Jack Johnson, and you can always follow me on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15 and catch these podcast episodes wherever you get your podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and Google Podcasts. Just be sure to hit that follow button and subscribe. You enjoy the weekend. You enjoy the games, whether it's baseball or football, and we will talk to you on Monday, Kansas City.